My daughter said, "Mom, you don't need to come this summer. My husband thinks it's better if we keep the lake house for our family. I built it with my money, so I sold it before the 24th of June. The phone rang while I was seasoning a pot of vegetable soup. I remember that detail because everything about that evening had felt ordinary, right up until it didn't. The windows over my kitchen sink reflected the last of the fading light, and soft music drifted out from the old radio I keep by the coffee maker. I almost let it ring through. Since retiring, most calls can wait a few minutes, but I dried my hands on the dish towel and pressed the speaker button without even checking who it was. "Mom," my daughter said fast, like she'd rehearsed it in the car. "I just wanted to let you know you don't need to come to the lake house this summer. My husband thinks it would be better if we keep it for our immediate family this year." There wasn't even a real pause before she added, "Love you. I'll call later." The line went dead. I stood there with the wooden spoon still in my hand while the soup bubbled quietly behind me. At first, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. The lake house? The one I had bought with my own money? The one I had spent nearly 2 years building up out of an empty stretch of land? Surely she couldn't have meant that house. I switched off the burner and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the dark screen of my phone like it might explain itself if I looked at it long enough. I'm 68 years old, a retired registered nurse, and I've been a widow for 9 years now. I spent more than 3 decades of my working life learning to read pain before a patient could even say the word out loud. I thought that meant I'd gotten good at recognizing it in myself too. I was wrong. Some wounds don't announce themselves. They just show up in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable evening and sit down across from you. I thought about calling her back, not to start a fight. I only wanted to hear her say it again, slower, with something that resembled an explanation attached to it. Instead, I set the phone face down on the table and didn't touch it for the rest of the night. Sometimes silence tells you more than another conversation would. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in the dark replaying her words, and what stuck with me wasn't cruelty. There wasn't any real cruelty in her voice. It was the casualness. She'd said it the way you'd mention a scheduling conflict, as if someone else's preference had already settled the matter, and informing me was just a formality tacked onto the end of it. By the time the sun came up, I understood that something between us had shifted. I just hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened. The lake house had never been an impulsive purchase. Years before my husband got sick, we used to take weekend drives out through the northern part of the state. No destination in mind, just to get out of the house. Every time we passed a quiet lake, he'd slow the car down and get this particular look on his face. "One day," he'd say, like it was a settled fact rather than a wish, "we'll have a porch looking out over water." I always laughed it off. "We're a nurse and an accountant," I'd tell him. "Not millionaires. We don't need millions," he'd say. "Just enough." Those conversations stopped when the diagnosis came. Hospital visits replaced the weekend drives. Treatment schedules replaced vacation planning. Hope, slowly and without any single dramatic moment, turned into acceptance, and then into the particular quiet that comes after acceptance. After he passed, I spent close to 18 months just learning how to exist without him in the house. The mail still came addressed to both of us for the first year. I kept his side of the closet full for longer than I probably should have. Then one afternoon, going through a box I hadn't opened since the move, I found an old spiral notebook of his. Inside were pencil sketches. Nothing elaborate, nothing an architect would recognize as a real plan, just a wraparound porch, a big kitchen window facing east, a stone fireplace along one wall. Just home, drawn the way someone draws a home when they're only imagining it for themselves at 2 in the morning. I cried harder that afternoon than I had in months, not because the drawings were sad, because they reminded me that dreams don't necessarily die along with the person who first imagined them. Sometimes somebody else has to be the one to finish them. I used what was left of his life insurance, combined with the savings I'd put away over 3 decades of hospital shifts, and I bought 6 acres overlooking the lake. The deed listed exactly one owner, me. Every payment came out of my own accounts. Every decision about materials and layout was mine to make. Every permit carried my signature and nobody else's. This wasn't a family investment. It wasn't an inheritance sitting around waiting to be claimed. It was my home, built out of somebody else's unfinished sketch and my own stubbornness. Building it tested every ounce of patience I had left in me. Every other weekend, I made the 2-hour drive out to meet with contractors, approve materials, answer an endless stream of questions I didn't feel qualified to answer. What kind of flooring did I want? What style of cabinets? What color for the roof? The builder, a quiet man who didn't waste words, told me once that if I wanted it done right, I'd need patience. "I've waited my whole life for this," I told him. "I can wait a little longer." Room by room, over the better part of 2 years, the house came together out of bare concrete and stacks of lumber and my own stubborn insistence on getting it right. When construction finally ended, I drove out on a weekday morning and unlocked the front door by myself. No balloons. No family waiting inside with a cake or a bottle of something to celebrate with. Just silence. And yet it didn't feel lonely the way I might have expected. It felt peaceful. The particular kind of peaceful that comes after a long stretch of effort finally lets go of your shoulders. I walked through every room slowly, running my hand along walls I had watched rise up out of nothing over 2 years of weekend visits. When I reached the kitchen, the morning light came in across the hardwood floors exactly the way he had once imagined it on paper, decades earlier, without ever knowing whether he'd lived to see it built. I stood in the living room a long while, looking at the stone fireplace I'd argued with 3 different contractors about getting right. The mantel was still bare. I hadn't brought a single photograph out yet, hadn't hung a single picture, but I could already see it build in my mind, the way you can look at an empty frame and know exactly what belongs inside it. Upstairs, the guest room still smelled faintly of fresh paint. I opened the window to let some of the lake air in and stood there a moment just breathing it, thinking about all the grandchildren who might one day sleep in that that room without ever knowing how many weekends it had taken to build. For the first time since I'd lost him, I smiled without having to force it. I said it out loud, into the empty house, not expecting anyone to hear it. We finally made it. The words carried a little ways into the living room and then faded out. I stood there a long moment, just letting the house be quiet around me. I believed, standing in that kitchen, that this would be the place where our family gathered for decades to come. Birthdays, holidays, the grandchildren I didn't have yet, learning to swim off that little dock I'd had built along the shoreline. I never once imagined that the same house would eventually become the reason my family started to come apart at the seams. I locked up that afternoon and drove the 2 hours home with the windows down, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was driving away from anything. I felt like I was driving toward something instead. The first summer after the house was finished turned into everything I'd hoped it might be, and then some. My daughter arrived with her husband and their 2 kids on a warm Friday afternoon, tires crunching up the gravel drive, kids already unbuckling before the car had fully stopped. My son drove in the following day with his wife, arms full of grocery bags because he'd stopped at the store halfway there, unwilling to show up empty-handed. By sunset that first Friday, the house had gone from quiet to genuinely alive. Laughter carried across the back porch. The grandchildren chased each other barefoot through the grass while my son-in-law manned the grill near the patio, flipping burgers and telling a story nobody was fully listening to, but everybody was enjoying anyway. My son hauled coolers in from the garage without being asked, and his wife set the dining table before I could stop her, laying out napkins like she'd done it there 100 times already. For the first time in years, every room in that house had someone in it. Every chair had somebody sitting in it. Meals stretched long past when the food was gone, into conversations that ran well into the dark. Those few days became some of the happiest of my whole life. Every morning before anyone else woke up, my daughter would join me in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, and we'd sit by the big windows looking out at the water, talking about nothing in particular. Her job, her kids, the small stuff that fills up an ordinary life and somehow ends up mattering more than the big stuff. "You really did it, Mom," she said one of those mornings, looking around the kitchen like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been there 3 days already. "I guess I did," I told her. "Your father would have loved this place. I built it for both of us," I added, and meant it. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and in that particular moment, I believed, without a shred of doubt, that nothing could ever come between us. If I could go back and freeze one single morning of my life in place, it would be that one, because the following summer felt different. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough that I started to notice. My daughter's husband started making suggestions. At first, they sounded harmless enough, the kind of thing anyone might say wandering through somebody else's house. "You know," he said one weekend, standing in the doorway of the upstairs guest room with his hands on his hips like he was already measuring it, "this would make a great home office." Another visit, a few weeks later, he pointed at the unfinished storage room off the garage. "You could easily convert this into another bedroom. Wouldn't take much." I nodded along, polite about it. "They're interesting ideas," I told him. He smiled, pleased with himself. "I've been thinking about ways to improve the place." The word choice struck me as a little odd at the time, though I didn't dwell on it. Improve the place, as if the place already belonged to him and he was simply doing the responsible thing by planning ahead for it. Still, I told myself that families talk about ideas all the time. There was no reason to read anything more into it than that. A few weeks after that conversation, I drove up for another weekend and noticed the furniture in the living room had been rearranged without a word to me. The reading chair I had carefully positioned next to the fireplace, angled just right to catch the afternoon light, now sat pushed against the opposite wall. Several of the framed photographs that used to line the mantel were gone. When I wandered upstairs, I found the guest bedroom had been turned into his workspace. A computer monitor, a filing cabinet, shelves stacked with folders from his job. Nobody had mentioned any of it to me beforehand. My daughter noticed me looking around, taking it all in. "Oh," she said, casual as anything. "He thought this layout worked better." "I see," I said. "It makes more sense this way, I suppose." I forced a smile onto my face. "If you're comfortable with it." Inside, though, something didn't sit right with me. Nobody had asked my opinion. They had simply decided, the way you decide something about your own house rather than somebody else's. The small changes kept coming over the months that followed, each one easy enough to dismiss on its own, and together adding up to something I didn't want to look at too closely. The kitchen cabinets got reorganized one visit. My spice rack moved to a lower shelf. The good pans I'd bought specifically for that kitchen pushed to the back to make room for a set of his cookware I didn't recognize. My gardening tools disappeared out of the shed entirely, and when I asked, my daughter mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her husband needed the space for his fishing equipment. Even the rhythm of our family weekends started bending around his schedule rather than anyone else's. If he had a work call, breakfast happened later than usual. If he wanted quiet in the afternoon, the grandchildren got quietly redirected to play farther from the house, out of earshot. One weekend, I found a new lock installed on the shed itself, a little combination padlock I hadn't asked for and didn't have the code to. When I mentioned it, my daughter explained that they'd started keeping some of the more expensive fishing gear out there, and it just made sense to keep it secured. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, who exactly they thought might be wandering onto the property to steal a tackle box. She laughed it off like I was being dramatic, and I let it go, the way I'd been letting everything go for months by that point. One Saturday afternoon, I came in from a walk to find my daughter up on a step stool, taking down the curtains in the living room. "The blue ones looked a little dated," she explained before I'd even asked. "I liked those curtains," I said. She hesitated, holding the fabric bunched in her arms. "I know, but these will brighten the room up." I looked around the living room carefully, carefully after she'd finished hanging the new ones. Nearly every decorative choice in that space reflected my daughter and her husband's taste now. Mine had quietly disappeared, piece by piece, without a single conversation about it. I told myself, the way I'd been telling myself for months at that point, that families change, people redecorate. It wasn't worth starting a fight over a set of curtains or a padlock or a rearranged cabinet. But somewhere underneath that reasonable, generous version of events, I knew this was never really about curtains. It was about whose house this still was, about whether anyone besides me still remembered. The conversation that changed everything happened toward the end of that second summer, on an evening that started out ordinary enough. We were all sitting out on the back porch, watching the grandchildren skip stones across the water in the last of the daylight, and my daughter's husband leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who felt entirely at home. You know, he said, thoughtful, like he'd been turning the idea over for a while before saying it out loud, we probably spend more time here than anyone else does. My daughter nodded along without hesitation. That's true. It would probably make sense, he went on, if we just treated this as our permanent vacation place going forward. I looked over at him. What exactly do you mean by that? He shrugged like the answer was obvious. You hardly use it anymore. I use it whenever I choose to, I said. But we're out here almost every weekend, practically. My daughter spoke up gently, trying to smooth it over the way she'd started doing more and more often lately. I think he just means it makes practical sense, Mom. Nothing more than that. Practical. There was that word again. The same one that had shown up around the curtains and the fishing equipment and every other quiet decision that had been made without me over the past year. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my voice level. This house was never about convenience. Neither of them answered right away. The silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the grandchildren's laughter carrying up from the shoreline. Finally, my daughter offered up a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course it's still your house, Mom. She said the words, but by then, something in the way she said them had stopped sounding true. That night, once everyone had gone up to bed, I stayed out on the porch alone long past midnight. The lake sat perfectly still under the moon, but something inside me had started to stir in a way it hadn't before. For the first time since I'd built that house with my own hands and my own money, I felt like a guest inside the very walls that carried my name on every legal document that existed for it. I didn't know it yet, but the hardest lesson of all was still waiting for me, and it would arrive in the mail less than 2 weeks later, in the form of a single plain envelope. The envelope showed up on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning. It looked completely ordinary from the outside. Plain white, my name typed neatly across the front in a font I didn't recognize. No handwritten note, no greeting card, nothing that hinted at what was actually waiting inside it. I carried it into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee out of habit, and opened it without giving it much thought at all. Within a few seconds of reading, my appetite was gone entirely. The letter came from an attorney I had never once met or spoken to. The language inside it was polite, carefully worded, thoroughly professional, the kind of letter written by somebody trained to make an unreasonable request sound perfectly reasonable. It explained that my daughter and her husband wished to discuss transferring ownership of the lake house into their names. According to the letter, such a transfer would simply simplify future family planning and ensure the property remained available for future generations. There was no accusation buried in it anywhere, no threat, no legal demand of any kind, just a quiet, confident assumption that I would eventually sit down and sign whatever they put in front of me. I read it through twice, then a third time, slower, in case I'd missed some context that would make the whole thing make sense. Each reading made exactly one thing clearer than it had been before. Somebody out there had already decided they had a claim to my home. Not a legal claim. The deed made that impossible, and any competent attorney would have told them as much before drafting the letter. A different kind of claim, the kind that doesn't need a deed to feel true to the person holding it. I folded the pages back up carefully and slid them into the envelope. For several long minutes, I just sat there at the kitchen table, staring out the window at nothing in particular. The real issue was never the paperwork itself. It was the confidence sitting underneath it. Nobody pays a lawyer to send a letter like that unless they've already convinced themselves the answer is going to be yes. 3 days after the letter arrived, I decided to drive out to the lake house without telling anyone I was coming. The drive felt strangely familiar and unusually heavy at the same time. For years, every trip out there had filled me with a kind of quiet excitement. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving straight towards something I already half suspected and didn't actually want confirmed. When I pulled up, everything looked exactly the way it always had. The flower beds along the front walk were in full bloom. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze off the water. The lake itself shimmered under the afternoon sun like nothing in the world had changed. From the outside, you'd never have guessed anything was different. I walked up to the front door, reached into my purse for my key, and slid it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I frowned and tried again, jiggling it the way you do when you assume it's just a stubborn lock rather than the actual problem. Nothing. I checked my keyring to make sure I hadn't somehow grabbed the wrong one. No, it was the right key. I tried a third time, more slowly. The lock had been changed. I stood there on my own front porch for a long moment, just staring at the doorknob, as if enough time spent looking at it might somehow undo what it meant. The realization arrived before I'd even reached for my phone. Someone had changed the locks on my own house without saying a single word to me about it. I called my daughter. She picked up on the second ring. "Hi, Mom. My key doesn't work." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Oh, right," she said, her voice suddenly a little too casual. "He had the locks changed last week." "Why?" "It was just for security." "Security from whom exactly?" "It wasn't a big deal, Mom." "It becomes a big deal," I said, "when the owner of the house can't get inside it." Another pause, longer this time. "I meant to to tell you, she said, but you didn't. She sighed, the particular sigh of someone who thinks they're the one being inconvenienced. We'll get you another key. I looked at the closed door in front of me. My own house shouldn't require anyone's permission to walk into. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then quietly she said, I'm sorry, but the apology only acknowledged how I felt about it. It didn't touch what they'd actually done. I never asked for a replacement key. Instead, I turned around, walked back to the car, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The house stood only a few yards away from where I was parked. A house I had spent 2 years and every dollar I had building from bare ground into somewhere worth living. A house that, in that particular moment, felt farther away from me than any place I had ever lived in my entire life. I stayed parked in that driveway for close to 20 minutes, not crying, just thinking, methodically, the way you think through a diagnosis once you've finally stopped denying the symptoms. Over the past 2 years, I had waved off every single warning sign as it came, the rearranged furniture, the changed decorations, the casual conversations about practical arrangements, and now the attorney's letter sitting in my glove compartment. Now, finally, the evidence was standing directly in front of me in the shape of a locked door. They hadn't forgotten whose name was on the deed. They had simply stopped expecting me to act like it still mattered. That realization hurt considerably more than the locked door itself ever could have. Back at my own house that evening, I pulled the large folder out of my office cabinet, the one where I keep everything connected to the property. Inside were the purchase agreement, the recorded deed, the construction invoices going back 2 years, the building permits, the bank statements, the insurance policy. Page after page, every single one carried exactly one legal owner's name. No joint ownership listed anywhere. No trust, no transfer agreement of any kind. Nothing in that entire folder gave anyone else legal authority over that property. I spread the papers out across my dining room table and went through them one at a time, methodically, the way I used to review a patient's chart before a shift. For the first time in months, I stopped making excuses for my daughter and her husband. Facts don't need much interpretation once you finally let yourself look at them plainly. Either someone respects what belongs to you, or they don't. There isn't really a middle category, no matter how much you might want there to be one. That evening, I called my daughter one more time. I was thinking about coming out to the lake house this weekend, I told her. She hesitated before answering. This weekend might not really work, Mom. I'd stay out of everyone's way. We already have plans. Oh, what about the weekend after that? Another pause. I'll have to ask my husband. Those words sat in my chest for a long time after we hung up. I'll have to ask my husband. She wasn't asking the woman who'd signed every check for that house. She was asking the man who had already, somewhere along the way, started acting like the owner in every way that mattered except the legal one. I ended the call politely enough. Afterward, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen for a long while, not doing anything in particular, just letting the weight of it settle. Then I opened my laptop and searched for local real estate agents near the lake. By midnight, I'd picked one out. The next morning, I called and scheduled an appointment. For the first time since all of this had started, months earlier, with a single dismissive phone call over a pot of soup, I wasn't just reacting to whatever happened next anymore. I was getting ready to make a decision of my own that would change everything that came after it. The agent arrived the following Thursday afternoon, and unlike a lot of people in her line of work I'd encountered over the years, she didn't waste any time making promises she couldn't back up. She walked the property slowly with a small notebook in hand, occasionally stopping to jot something down, pausing longest at the kitchen windows and the stone fireplace. After close to an hour, she joined me out on the back porch, looking over the water. You've taken excellent care of this place, she said. I've tried to. The market's strong right now, especially for a property like this. I'm not interested in a long, drawn-out process, I told her. She studied my face for a moment before asking gently, has something happened? I smiled, keeping it light. Let's just say I'm ready for a new chapter. She didn't push for more than that. I appreciated it. Some stories don't need explaining to strangers, even helpful ones. The listing went live the following Monday. The photographs the agent's photographer took captured every room exactly the way I remembered designing it years earlier. The spacious kitchen, the stone fireplace, the screened porch facing the water, the light coming through at sunrise the way I'd stood there and watched it happen, alone, the day construction finished. Within 24 hours, the agent called with an update. We already have 3 showings scheduled. By the end of that same week, the number had doubled. Interest came in from families looking for a summer place, from retirees hoping for something quiet on the water, and from one couple hoping to relocate there full-time. Every evening for the better part of a week, the agent called with more news. We've got our first offer in, the next day. Now there are 2. Then a third came in. And this one's all cash, she added. She emailed each proposal over for me to look through. Some buyers offered more money but wanted extended inspection periods and long closing timelines stretched out over months. One couple submitted a clean, straightforward cash offer with a short closing window and almost no conditions attached at all. The agent pointed to that particular contract. If I were advising my own mother, she said, this is the one I'd tell her to take. I agreed with her immediately. The amount exceeded what I'd expected going in, but the money, surprisingly, wasn't actually what convinced me. It was the certainty of it. I wanted the whole thing finished and recorded before anyone had a chance to interfere with it. The paperwork moved fast after that. I met the agent and the closing attorney in a small conference room overlooking the courthouse square. Stacks of documents already arranged neatly on the table waiting for me. The attorney went through every page carefully, in no particular hurry, explaining each section before sliding it across for my signature. Do you understand, he asked at one point, that once these documents are recorded, ownership transfers permanently to the buyers? I understand completely. He looked up at me. And you're signing voluntarily? Absolutely. I signed my name one final time on that last page. page. When the notary finished stamping everything, the attorney extended his hand across the table. "Congratulations," he said. For a brief second, I wasn't entirely sure that congratulations was the right word for what I was feeling. Relief, maybe, or something closer to freedom. A week later, the sale officially closed. The funds landed in my account early one morning, and I looked at the new balance exactly once before closing the banking app on my phone. Money had never really been the point of any of this. Peace was the point. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, I actually had some. I spent the next several days quietly settling back into my ordinary routine. Morning walks, some gardening, reading out on my own patio with a cup of tea going cold beside me. I didn't reach out to my daughter. She didn't reach out to me either. The silence between us felt strange at first, and then, oddly, it felt like relief. It gave me room to think clearly for what felt like the first time in months. I had no idea, sitting quietly in my garden that week, just how loudly that silence was about to break. Everything changed the following Saturday. My phone rang repeatedly, starting just after noon. 3 missed calls, then 4, then 6 in a row. I finally picked up on what must have been the 7th try. "Mom," my daughter sounded breathless, like she'd been running. I stayed quiet, waiting. "They're moving furniture inside. Strangers. They said they bought the property." I didn't say anything right away. "What do you mean, Mom? Please, what's going on?" "That's correct," I said finally. "I sold the house." Silence stretched out on the other end of the line, long enough that I could hear her breathing change. "You sold it without telling us?" "It was my property to sell." Her breathing grew heavier. "But we've been staying there all year, Mom. We had plans." "So did I said. "When you called me to say I didn't need to come to my own house this summer. When your attorney mailed me papers asking me to sign away ownership. When somebody changed the locks on my own front door without a single word of warning to me. You'd already decided it was yours a long time before I did anything at all about it." She didn't interrupt any of it. When I finished, there was nothing but silence on the line. "We never thought you'd actually sell it," she said finally. "I know," I told her. In the background, I could hear a man's voice, her husband, asking something I couldn't make out. She covered the phone, and when she came back, her voice had changed. "What are we supposed to do now?" "Exactly what every homeowner does," I said, "when a house doesn't belong to them anymore." She didn't respond. The call ended quietly, without either of us saying goodbye. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in well over a year, I wasn't waiting on somebody else's next decision. My own had already been made. The calls kept coming for nearly a week. Most went unanswered. I simply didn't have anything left that needed explaining. Every important conversation had already happened, more than once over 2 years. They just hadn't been listening when it mattered. On the 8th day, my daughter left a voicemail. Her voice sounded different, the confidence gone missing from it. "Mom, can we please talk? I think we both said things we shouldn't have. I know you're upset, but maybe we can work this out." I listened to it twice before deleting it. Some problems can be solved with one more honest conversation. Others start because too many honest conversations got ignored until there weren't any left to have. This was the second kind. A few days later, there was a knock at my door. My daughter stood on the porch alone, dark circles under her eyes. "May I come in?" I stepped aside and let her in. We sat down together at the same kitchen table where she used to drink coffee with me every summer morning. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, she broke the silence. "I never thought it would end like this," she said. "My husband believed that eventually you'd leave the house to us anyway." "I probably would have. Eventually. I likely would have left it to both of my children one day, when the time came." She stared at me. "Then why sell it? Why not just wait?" "Because an inheritance is a gift," I said. "It isn't something people take from you while you're still alive to feel it happening." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I didn't realize how much we'd hurt you, Mom. Not until it was already too late to fix." "That's because neither of you ever stopped long enough to ask me how I felt about any of it." She admitted things then that I had already suspected but never heard confirmed out loud. The attorney's letter had been entirely her husband's idea, start to finish. Changing the locks had also been his decision. At first, she tried to claim she'd simply gone along with his suggestions to keep the peace. Then she stopped herself. "That's not completely true," she said quietly. "I agreed with him because somewhere along the way, part of me actually started believing the house was already ours, not legally, but in every other way that mattered day to day. I forgot that you were sharing your dream with us. I started treating it like it was my own." Sitting across from her, I believed she genuinely understood what had happened between us. But understanding doesn't automatically undo consequences. It just means you finally see them clearly for what they are. "You can't bring back the house," I told her, "but you can decide how you treat people from here on out." She hugged me without a word on her way out. I hugged her back just as tightly, not because everything was repaired, but because carrying that weight any longer wasn't going to do either of us any good. Forgiveness doesn't always rebuild trust. Sometimes it just clears space for your own heart to keep moving forward. Over the months that followed, my life settled back into something genuinely peaceful. I bought a smaller cottage closer to my hometown, looking out over a quiet park instead of a lake. It wasn't the dream my husband and I had once talked about on those old weekend drives. That dream had already done what it was meant to do. Now I wanted something simpler. My son visited often and never once asked about the money. One evening on my porch, he told me I seemed happier than he'd seen me in a long while. I am. What changed? I finally stopped confusing generosity with obligation. He nodded slowly. "I think Dad would have agreed with that." So do I. People sometimes believe the hardest part of losing a home is handing over the keys. It isn't. The hardest part is realizing someone you love stopped seeing it as yours long before you ever agreed to let it go. I don't regret building that lake house or selling it either. That decision taught me something I should have learned decades earlier, that respecting yourself is never selfish, no matter how it gets framed by the people standing closest to you. Ownership, whether it's a house or a life, belongs to whoever ever had the courage to build it, not to whoever eventually decided they were comfortable enough to move in. Sometimes the greatest gift you can leave your family isn't a piece of property. It's knowing exactly when to stand up for yourself, even when it costs you something you loved.